Good evening and welcome. I'm delighted to be in conversation this evening with Stephen Uzzell, author of Amazon #1 chart bestseller, I Am Juden, which was published last year. Copy of the book. The book is a fictionalized account of the true life story of Chaim Michael Klar, a Jew born in 1909 in the Pale of Settlement, who fought with the Zionist partisans in Poland and lived a double life, masquerading as an officer of the SS. Uzzell describes him as a hero deserving recognition like Oskar Schindler. However, while there are many accounts of Schindler's factory, and there was abundant material for Tom Keneally to research what became known as Schindler's List, there is scant documentation on Klar. We know that he impersonated an SS officer at Auschwitz and, at great risk to his own life, eased the suffering of prisoners, saving them from the most terrible of fates. Uzzell builds his narrative around Joseph Siegler and introduces us to migration from the Pale of Settlement, the Jewish intelligentsia, tensions within Zionist and nationalist approaches to resistance, the uncertainty and insecurity of Europe's Jews in villages, in ghettos, in forced labor, and as they face death. The book shows humor and tragedy. We're drawn into the characters even as we learn or reappraise one of the dark episodes in recent Jewish history. I Am Juden has sold over 20,000 copies since January 2019. Just a reminder that everyone is on mute, but we will be opening up the microphones for questions, and please do send questions in through the chat or put up your hands in the participants tab, and I shall try to monitor that as well as staring at my cell phone. So it's a great pleasure to welcome the author all the way from Brighton. Good evening, Stephen Uzzell.
Good evening, Rabbi, and thank you very much for thinking of me and for asking me on. It really is it's an honor for me.
So it's a great pleasure, and I'd like to thank Darren Lewis for putting us in touch. I'd like to ask, what prompted you to write I Am Juden?
The prompt came when I was originally interested in a very, very different type of story. About 15 years ago, a film came out with Ryan Gosling called The Believer. And it was a true story about set 1950s, about an American Jewish man who joined the American Nazi Party and was a Nazi. And I was originally interested in writing this, thinking, what a disturbed young man, what led him to do this? And as I was searching for this, I found another Google search pop up under the title Jewish Nazi. And that led me to the Illinois branch of the Holocaust Survivors Association, where I found the story of Chaim Michael Klar, a very different Jewish Nazi. And it began there. It began with that one webpage. So
tell us a little bit about Chaim Michael Klar, the real person, first of all.
What people remember from Auschwitz is a kindly guard who looked out for them, who gave them extra food, who shielded the most vulnerable, who led them away from execution into more work-based tasks that would keep them alive, and that he had confided in a number of prisoners that he was Jewish and that he was here to help them, and they referred to him as their guardian angel. What led him into Auschwitz towards the end of the war is much less certain. As you said in your introduction, he'd grown up in the Pale of Russia. He'd traveled across Europe, as many Eastern European Jews had at that time, from country to country, finding refuge. And he slowly got dragged into this position that he didn't really seek out or expect to find himself in. But the facts are few and far between, unfortunately, as I found out.
Right. So there are a couple of there are a couple of sketchy attempts to complete the story that you can find online. I know you found in America there was a survivors group that had written about it, and in fact there's a suggestion that actually he may have returned and worked as an engineer in Israel in the company that some people will be familiar with, Solel Bonnet, online. But in fact, the real story turns cold. You know, we're not sure of the information, and so you decided that you would fictionalize his story.
Yeah, I'd originally wanted to write his biography, and there were just too many gaps in his life, and I tried all sorts of ways to get into contact with people who might have known him. Unfortunately, his wife and daughter both died after the war, and he had no other relatives. So I just kept turning up dead ends, and I thought, how can I tell this story? And then I just thought I'll create a very similar character, and this is almost, I think of it as an imaginary biography.
Right. So you're not naturally you know, a historical researcher or somebody with a particular Holocaust interest. What is it you do?
I'm an English teacher in secondary school just outside of Brighton.
Teaching literature.
Sorry, yes, I teach English language and literature from age 12 up to A level, and I'm in charge of English A level in my college.
Well, what are they doing at the moment with English A levels?
We've had to predict them grades for this year based upon their prior work. So this year's lot should be okay. It's more uncertain is how it will affect next year's, given that they've had so much time out of school.
Right. And what books are you teaching? What are the set try that again. What are the set texts at the moment?
So we've got a bit of Shakespeare. We've got the Scottish play, which I'm not allowed to mention. We've got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was actually a big influence on I Am Juden, and the idea of duality and good and bad contained within one man. It was quite strange to be writing the book and teaching Jekyll and Hyde you know, at the same time.
So let me just say one of the things I really enjoyed about reading I Am Juden is the fact that your love of English literature comes into it. And one of the things you do is weave parallel stories that people would have been reading at the time and would have had some kind of cachet in the intellectual society in Germany into the book. And a couple of times I ran to Google to check, was it really possible that somebody would have read Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle during that time? And absolutely yes. So you've done your homework in that. And if people are interested in the spread of literature, that comes across. So have you involved your students at all in the writing of it? Did you try out passages on them or anything?
I didn't know. I didn't really want to stand up and bang a drum and say I'm a writer. I don't really like being the center of attention in that way. But they did find out. I think one of their fathers had bought the book and had put two and two together and realized it was me. And so there was a spell where they all got very excited, and teaching them normal lessons got quite difficult, and all they wanted to talk about was the book and how I'd written it and what had taken me there.
Right. So you haven't put on somebody's mark, you know, B minus minus, take it from me. I've sold 20,000 copies. Listen, and you too can improve.
No, I haven't done that. I am very touched, though, that I've got 2 Year 10 boys in my class who I think they would admit that they've never read a book in their life. And when we have our reading time in lessons, they are sitting there ploughing through my book, which is not an easy read for a 14-year-old, particularly one who is not that into books. And I'm so touched to see them sitting there determined to read this book.
So as well as the Holocaust research, you must have done a fair amount of Jewish research. as well. I know, but the audience here possibly doesn't know, and there's nothing in the book that would tell people that you're not actually Jewish. What switched you on to wanting to write a Holocaust story from a Jewish perspective?
I do have distant Jewish relatives that I've never really talked about, but my grandmother, I think, was Jewish. And it was something that both of my parents went to lengths to educate us about. We did go on a trip to Krakow, to the ghetto and to Auschwitz about 15 years ago. And I think that was probably the catalyst.
This was a trip you went with your parents?
Yes, my parents, my sister, her husband. I mean, we weren't children by that stage at all. I was probably in my mid-20s.
So what makes somebody take a family vacation with their grown-up kids to Auschwitz? What was in the family mind there?
I think I would just say it was something my father particularly thought we should see, and we should educate ourselves about, and just to do our bit in keeping those memories alive, I suppose. We certainly have no family connections to it.
Right. And your father's background is?
Very humble. His father was this is ironic for a Jewish audience, but his father was a pig farmer in Wiltshire at the turn of the century. So Dad grew up with very little in terms of books or interest in his education. He managed to educate himself as an older man in his 30s. He did a part-time degree and went on to become an accountant and then a professor of accountancy at what was then a polytechnic. So he'd made quite a journey himself.
Right. And when we were chatting earlier, you said one of the things I asked, who were you writing the book for? And one of the people you said is you really wanted to write it for your dad. Yeah,
it was that kind of reader I had in mind. Someone who is a layman who knows the broad details, but not the finer points. And who wants to be taken on a journey, I suppose.
Right, so you take people through the expulsion from the Pale of Settlement, or being refugees from the Pale of Settlement, coming into, coming a little bit west, heading into the university scene, the challenges of being a little bit more intelligent and intellectual than your background, and then the trouble with being an educated Jew in the non-Jewish world, and then having to step back into being a shoemaker in times of poverty. At the same time as doing that, you're teaching the history of Abba Kovner and the partisans. Where did you get all your material from?
I've toured around Central and Eastern Europe quite extensively. I've spent time in Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland. I've toured all the museums. I've spoken to the guides. I've read all of the books. But you're absolutely right. It was the story of resistance that I felt hasn't been told, and that's what I wanted to get across in this book, that not all Jews went quietly, as has often been portrayed. And you said Abba Kovner there, the man whose famous speech in the Wilno ghetto, "We shall not be led like lambs into the slaughter." And Jews did fight back, and they resisted, and it was that story that I felt had been marginalized to some extent by portrayals.
Right. So you did this research, and you did it all online, or you went over?
No, I've worked in Czechoslovakia for 2 years before I became an English teacher here. I've spent a long time touring around the various sites and places I talk about in real time, in real, as it were, being there. But then it was, yes, 5 years research before I felt comfortable to write the book. So Martin Gilbert's History of the Holocaust, a couple of different books by Nekama Tech, who wrote Defiance, about the partisans in the forest in Russia, and another book she wrote, which is I really recommend this book. It's called Into the Lion's Den: The Life of Oswald Rufeisen. And he was a man who led a very similar life to Michael Clark. He led this double existence, and I was able to use a lot of her stories in I Am Juden. That's a fantastic book.
Right. So just in case people think that it's going to read a little bit like either a Zionist manual, a Jewish history book, or a travelogue of Eastern Europe, let's listen to a passage from the book from you, where I think it brings out sort of the balance, a little bit of the humor and the personal touch. Just as Stephen's looking for it, people do feel free to stick your hand up and send some comments in the chat while he's reading. I'll have a look down the chat a little bit, and listen also to the voice of the author. And he's writing, the whole book is written from the perspective of the protagonist, from Josef Streicher. So sorry, let's try that again. And oops, sorry, my computer is playing games here. From Josef Ziegler. Streicher, of course, was the cartoonist of Der Stürmer. So over to you, Stephen.
Okay, so just to set the scene, we're in 1940. In Lithuania has just been invaded. Joseph Ziegler has lost his job as a professor. He's had to retrain as a cobbler, and he's now been arrested as just for being Jewish, and he's been sent to a labor camp called Camp Moda, where highly skilled Jewish artisans are manufacturing uniforms, boots and shoes for the German army and for Nazi officers. And this was based on a real camp that was run by another kindly German who actually looked out for his workers and spared many of them and saved many lives. So it is actually a real camp. And in this passage, the camp is preparing for a high-level Nazi visit, and Joseph Ziegler has been told that he will be taking part in it. On the morning of August the 16th, we were woken an hour earlier than usual with no reason given. Breakfast was a bowl of thin, watered-down porridge, no egg or toast in sight. When I left the canteen to start work, I noticed the doors to the accommodation block had been padlocked shut, and a red sign proclaimed "No entry, closed for essential maintenance." "Is everything okay?" I said to Herschel, the absent-minded clicker with whom I shared a bench. He gave a mystifying wink. "Nothing to worry about." I tried to heed his advice and concentrate on my work. If the accommodation block was closed, I told myself, bad luck came in threes, and this morning's fill was my lot. It was certainly well overdue. But then, just before lunch, Herr Ritter paid a rare visit to the clicking room and requested my presence outside in the corridor. Whenever an employer makes an unscheduled appearance in my day, I fear the worst. Perhaps that is the lot of the working man. Even after a lecture at the sedate University of Kiel, I lived in fear that the head of philosophy would knock on my door to upbraid me for a controversial interpretation of Nietzsche, or a joke I may have cracked about the city burghers. As a Jew in Nazi-occupied Europe, you might conclude that a smattering of paranoia was well placed. "Don't fret," Herr Ritter said. He was the only man in the camp to speak to me in German, but usually only a curt Guten Morgen. You haven't done anything wrong. Quite the opposite, in fact. You're earning some glowing reviews. I am? A man of your intellect shouldn't look so surprised, Herr Siegler. He straightened his polka dot bow tie. It's time for you to really start earning your keep. I can work faster. I was unforgivably slow this morning. There's nothing wrong with your work, and everything right with it. On your first day, I believe you inquired of Oswald, what was the drawback of life in Moda? Yes, but I didn't mean to. Do you know the name Henrik Loser? Of course. I drew back, perplexed by Herr Ritter's change of tact. Reich Kommissar for the newly designated Ostland region. Very good. He was Oberpresident of the province of Schleswig-Holstein when I lived in Kiel. Exactly so. Yesterday he was in Kaunas, and at 1:30 this afternoon he will find time in his busy schedule to be our guest. The Reich Kommissar has requested a fitting for a pair of Adelaide semi-brogues. We are extremely honoured to receive a man of his stature, naturally. Henrik Loser's stature was 5'1" in heels. If he looked like a sour, baby-faced accountant, that's precisely what he was. A baby-faced accountant with a toothbrush moustache and a pair of thick round spectacles behind which his eyes blinked like gormless goldfish. We used to call him the FF, the Fat Führer. Tell a newspaper cartoonist to caricature a Nazi, and he'd end up drawing Henrik Loser. Tales of the man's temper were legendary in the cafes of Kiel. An avid horticulturalist, he'd once been summoned from his garden by his valet to take an urgent telephone call. When the Oberpresident found himself addressing a dead line, he repaid the courtesy by fracturing the valet's cheekbone with the receiver. Word of our craftsmanship is spreading far and wide, Herr Ritter continued. Great news for the camp, but it presents challenges in terms of recruitment. The labour pool, shall we say, is an ever-diminishing one. Today, the Reich Kommissar's appointment will be conducted by Josiah Seidel, one of our most eminent lasters.
Great. So we've got here the visit of a senior Nazi into the camp and the management of the camp, the labor camp, which is trying to be good to the Jews within it, notices that it's an ever diminishing camp. And you deal with the challenges of Siegler as he is being made to measure up the Nazi for his Adelaide brogues. And you have compassion for the management of the camp, some of whom have got just a little bit of Judaism in their background as well. I'm not sure if you're trying to put yourself somewhere in the picture with this sort of duality of identities. And then you've got the Nazis themselves, and within it you talk about the Nazis as here as being your stereotypical caricature of a Nazi. This is a caricature of a Nazi. How did you write the Nazi parts? And how did you get into their mindset? How do you script a Nazi?
Wow. That is a difficult question. I think I tried to see it in their terms. Many of them weren't so much interested in destroying Jews as just stealing what they could from them. There was a vast amount of plundering, of looting, and I saw them almost as a mafia gang who were using the Jews as their own private bank account or jewelry shops, and they were getting rich from it personally. Instead of kicking the money back to the Nazi party where they were meant to, they were lining their own pockets. And I would say greed was the motivating factor of many of the people implementing the Holocaust.
Right. I think that comes across in the way you portray things, because you've got the difficult discussions on Zionism amongst partisans, or even just before the beginning of the war, as people are choosing what to do, and the tension within people in how to respond and how to how to fight against what's happening on the one hand, whereas your Nazis are essentially narcissists and thugs.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a way I didn't want to spend too much time humanizing them.
All right. So one of the exceptions, I suppose, is the character who's the Chase.
Yes. So the Chase is based on a Major Karl Plagg, who was honored by Yad Vashem, the Righteous Amongst Nations, for his work in saving the largest single group of Jews who survived Vilnius. There were 10,000 Jews in Vilnius at the beginning of the war, and only 2,000 remained afterwards. And he had saved several hundred of those 2,000, and they had been men and women who had worked at his forced labor camp, the uniform factory that I turn into my camp Moda,
which is a shoe factory.
Yes, shoes, other army uniforms, accessories as well, but mainly shoes. And yeah, he was a man a bit like Oskar Schindler in a way, that he profited personally. He was getting rich, but he had a genuine benevolent side to him, and he did look after people. He did save Jews much more than he put himself in danger for doing so.
Right. And you deal with the tension, that the camp faces. It is seen as a little bit luxurious. So when the visitors come, the Nazis come, they have to strip down the luxury and feed them horrible food. Within that, you allude to the games that were played in the camps like Theresienstadt and others, where they made themselves look beautiful for Red Cross visits, and at the same time there's a show going on. But here you do it backwards. You visited camps, you visited Auschwitz. What did it feel like to be in the camps?
Oh, it was just chilling. There's just something in the air there. It's just a place unlike any other I've been on Earth. Even the forest, when you walk through it, is silent. If there is any wildlife in that forest, they're not chirping. There's no birds. There's no insects. You just hear absolutely nothing. It's like the life has been sucked out of it. I'm not a supernatural person, but it feels like something has been left there. Some mark has permanently soured that spot of land. It was beyond chilling.
So we feel this depth, and we feel this pain, and your ability to sort of get into the deep emotion comes across as you're speaking. Now you write that into Joseph's character. He feels the antagonistic forces within him. One of the problems is, as he is masquerading as an SS officer, he clearly needs to do bad things. And at the same time, he's trying to save Jews. How on earth do you characterize that conundrum?
That was the heart of it for me, the duality of his existence, and the thought that the only way he could really help Jews the most was to hang on to his position with the SS, because it was from there he could do the most good. But at the same time, to pass himself off, he had to sometimes betray Jews. He had to sometimes earn his money and get them arrested. And I guess that would have eaten him up completely. He tried to. My version of him. It's a tightrope he walks, and he gets away with doing the least amount of harm and the maximum amount of good that he could possibly do in those situations.
Yeah, one of my most frightening encounters was when I was with a camp survivor who was literally on his deathbed, and speaking to him. This was a couple of days before he passed away, and he was still able to talk. And he had done a couple of things on death marches. He took somebody's shoes, who was asleep, imagining the person wasn't going to survive the night, but he knew that if he had the shoes, he would survive the night. And he took them, and he picked up a crust of bread that somebody had thrown in a march, and threw it at a march. And he ducked down and picked it up, and the soldiers knew that somebody had ducked down, and didn't even stop to find out who did it. They called out who did it, and he didn't put his hand up, and the person next to him got shot. He knew he'd got that person shot. So he asked me as he was lying dying, what am I supposed to do? And how on earth do I atone for this? And he spent his life trying to do good deeds. Yeah. Your character here, is it possible to be an SS hero, doing things that incriminate a few in order to save others, killing people in order to save others? If you had to counsel him on his deathbed, what do you say?
It seems shallow to reduce life down to a balance sheet, but there's no doubt he saved more people than he harmed. Sorry. Is it a numbers game? No, but he did more help than good, and without him, hundreds, possibly thousands, we don't know, of people would have perished. The people he incriminated, or in some cases actually killed himself, were not always Jews. One of them was a German, for example, so I don't think that would have sit way too heavily on his conscience. And I just think he chose the people who, in some senses, death was a release for them. The people he incriminated, they were beyond saving, unfortunately.
Right. So it's great because the way you write the story, it leaves the viewers wrestling with this and understanding some of that tension and asking these questions. So it's.
Oh, thank you. I did. Yeah. That, as I said, that was at the heart of it for me, really.
Right. Who are your literary influences?
It would be crime. I started as a little kid reading Sherlock Holmes stories, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, some of the more crimey Charles Dickens, like the Oliver Twist and the Fagin Gang. And from then on, I went into Agatha Christie and the American hard-boiled Raymond Chandler, the LA Private Eyes. So that's where I came from, really, as a writer.
Right. So Oliver Twist's Fagin is a real character whose story I encountered. Ike Solomon, who was a pickpocket, who ended up in Australia. That's where I met him, or at least met his legacy and stories. And the trial of the original Ike Solomon is probably something that Dickens attended. And so you've got a great example there of a fictionalized account of a real story.
Yeah, thank you.
But it's definitely part of a novel. It's definitely written, for the novel, and certainly not to get anybody sympathy of it. But it's the contemporary accounts of that are great. So I've got a question here from Ashley Fulton. Hang on, let me give Ashley the opportunity to unmute. Can you unmute yourself there?
Thank you very much
Great.
for joining us this evening, and it's been very interesting. And you've got a very modest way about you, which we've all been appreciating here. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. What I'd like to ask is the title, I Am Juden, which strikes me as sort of non-grammatical. I can't personally make sense of it. And I'd like you to explain that to us if you can.
Yeah, I can. I will freely admit that I stole the title from an episode of Band of Brothers. It's the episode towards the end where the camps are liberated and Jewish prisoners are feebly walking out and encountering all sorts of people, from Russian soldiers to Americans to British. And in the chaos, the only way the Jews could identify themselves was to speak in this broken English and to say, Juden, I am Juden. And so I took that line, and it just seemed to me to kind of emblemize the struggle that Joseph goes through to preserve his Jewish faith through the horrors. So yes, it is ungrammatical. That has been pointed out to me, but I thought if it was good enough for Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, the producers of Band of Brothers, then it was good enough for me.
Great. So if anybody else has questions, please do feel free to signal on the participants tab or through the chat. How do you start getting your own book published? What was the journey there? Was everybody rushing to buy the bestseller?
I wish I could say it was easy. I sent the book to every publishing agent in the country. I've got over 100 rejection letters. This was several years of just sending out parts of the book, and not one of them wanted to look at it. And I'd given up any thoughts of publishing. I'd shelved it, put it away, and then a friend just talked me into the idea of publishing it myself. He said, the technology's there, it's not hard. And I needed a bit of convincing, but then I did it. So it's been self-published on Amazon. I've done everything down to the formatting the book, to the cover design, and I've been frankly astounded at the reaction it's had and the success it's had. I thought I might sell 5 copies to my friends and that would be it. I've been #1 now since March of last year, so I think it's 15 consecutive months. I mean, I not mean the #1 on Amazon, but in terms of how they structure things. So I'm in the Jewish historical fiction category. I'm in the Holocaust survivors category. And in those categories, it has been #1 for over a year, which has just blown me away completely.
Right. So any tips for people here who might be budding authors?
Definitely do not give up and do not let rejections knock you back. Do you mean in terms of how to self-publish, or?
It's said that everybody has a book in them. And it's also said most people should leave it there. I'm glad you didn't. But yeah, no, for the people who've got a book in them, what are you supposed to? What would you tell them?
If you have an idea that won't leave you alone, that just keep on nagging away, then to me that's a sign you've got to do something with it. And you might take a long time thinking about it and mulling it over, but sooner or later you've got to try putting pen to paper and making those first impressions on the page. And you might not even think of yourself as a writer, but everyone has to start somewhere. And the book you end up with won't look anything like your first attempts. You've got to get over the embarrassment, the uncomfortability you would feel with your first attempts. But if you feel, if you feel pulled to something, it's never been easier to get your work out there and to get it read by people today.
And how many drafts did it go through?
It was written unconventionally, as I was drafting it as I went along, which is not usually done. But because it had turned into such an epic book, way longer than I thought it would be, the only way I could keep a handle on it was to constantly go back to each chapter I'd finished, to go back and edit that and then move on. It was mainly just to keep all of the information in my head, all of the facts and figures and the encyclopedic elements of the book. If I went too long without re-editing, I would start to lose the various threads.
Right, and so that meant that you were constantly changing the direction and where you were heading. How did you choose where you wanted to take it to end?
Well, I started in a sense at the end, because the one thing I knew for a fact about Hey Michael Clarke is that he was in Auschwitz at the end of the war. So I knew where he was going to end. The hard thing was working out how to get him in that situation. What plausible set of events could lead an ex-Jewish professor into being a ghetto guard and then a guard in Auschwitz? That was the hard thing.
Right, I've got a great question from Irene. Irene, if you unmute yourself. Yep. Yeah, you're there.
Hello, Irene.
Hello. Irene's muted again.
Yes. I wondered whether the publication of and the success of the book has changed your life at all. Have people joined you as friends who you hadn't previously met? You're still working as an English teacher.
I am, yeah, still working as an English teacher.
Wonderful.
I've noticed the book cropping up in charity stores around Brighton, which was very strange to see that. It had been read. I was pleased to know it had been well thumbed through. But I suppose the biggest thing has been meeting so many thousands and thousands of people on Twitter and engaging with people who've read the book and developing Twitter friendships with people around the world. That's been something I never thought would happen.
Most novelists are saying nasty things about Twitter at the moment.
It's got many problems. I try to use it as a force for good and remembrance, and I try not to get involved in the political arguments that are going on.
Right. So, have you written another novel during lockdown?
Yeah, I started one last year, and I've just finished it in the last few weeks.
Another one that's going to be self-published, or you're sending this one off?
I still have the dream of being an accepted author. I would love somebody in the industry just to read my book and think, yes, this is worthy of publishing. I do crave that acceptance, I suppose, by the gatekeepers of the publishing world.
Right. What's the new book about?
It's a contemporary thriller set in Brighton about the legacy of traumatic events and how they get buried, and it concerns one street and a group of neighbours who don't know various secrets about each other, which come out during the book.
Are your neighbours still going to be talking to you at the end of it?
I hope so, yeah.
I had a friend of my wife's who's married to a rabbi, wrote a book about the Women's Auxiliary, the Ladies Guild for Shul. It was a fictional book. But as it was published, a number of former congregants realized that they were being referenced in the book So when you write about something you know about and people you know about, it's a fraught enterprise.
It is, yes. It's been said that you just shouldn't be a friend with a writer, really, because you're going to end up in one of their books sooner or later.
Right, just a relationship through Twitter. Does anybody else have any questions that they'd like to that they'd like to put to Stephen? So it's been lockdown has been writing, or you've done other things?
No, I mean the school day has continued just as it was. Our timetable has remained exactly the same. I'm delivering the same lessons. I'm just doing it remotely, and all of the students are logged on. So a mixture of video lessons and just read this and do these questions type thing. But and I've also been in school a couple of days a week teaching the children of key workers. I think there's been a bit of a perception that schools have been closed for the last 3 months, but that's not true at all.
Right, we're getting very mixed messages from parents in different schools about how hard their children are working and whether or not they're being set real lessons.
Yeah, no, I'm hearing that from some of my friends as well. But I know that, it's a good school I'm in. It's got a good reputation, and we hear very good things from parents in terms of how we've been engaging with students over the last few months. But yeah, right. It is a bit of a mixed bag.
Have you tried to get any of your students to write about this period, prose and poetry?
I run a writing club where students come along in a lunchtime and they bring their various bits and pieces, and we critique it. We sit around the table and in a constructive way help each other out. But they're more interested in writing dystopia, post-Hunger Games type apocalyptic scenarios. They're not so much interested in looking back.
Right. How do you get people involved in history and interested in history?
Well, I'd be a classic example of someone who never had much of an interest in history, and I never for a moment thought I'd become a writer of a historical book, not least something as monumental as the Holocaust to try to get to grips with. But I think you find the human story there. Within that era, you find the human story that connects to you, and then that can open the doors into so many other aspects.
Right, got a question from Joanne.
Hello, hi, good evening. Thank
Hello.
you, Steve. Very interesting. I'm just interested from the German perspective, because I used to work for many years for the cultural department of the German embassy in London. And
Right.
We used to have a lot of English writers go over to Germany to different schools and forums to introduce their books. And I just wondered if you've had any feedback from any Germans or introduced your book to any German audiences, and just wondering if you've had any feedback or anyone's bought your book in Germany. And it's probably early days, but I just wondered.
Part of the problem of being self-published is that I've got no team behind me to do things like translation, for example, so it hasn't been translated into any foreign languages. I know from Twitter that people in Germany have bought it and have read it, but in quite small numbers. And no, I haven't had any of those conversations about, as you said, kind of going over there and talking about the story to a German audience. That hasn't come up yet, no.
That might be something you might want to consider, because it's quite an interesting book. I haven't read it yet, but it sounds very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, how did you say that how did people arrange that?
Well, I used to organise, one of my jobs was to organise Jewish tours around Germany for Jewish audiences. So I took like the Chief Rabbi Mervis, for example, and a whole group of rabbis who'd never considered going to Germany for the first time. So I did that many years ago, and I've introduced Germany to audiences who would never have thought of going back because they didn't want to because of the Holocaust, etc. So it's very interesting work, and we used to take authors with us to give the Germans a different perspective on how the British look at the Holocaust or how Jews look at the Holocaust. And we used to go to various secondary schools with authors And most German children speak fluent English, so
Yeah.
I don't need to translate it. But it was just, I don't work there anymore, unfortunately. But it was just an interesting perspective to hear what the Germans have to say about people writing about their country and what's happened. So it's not actually, it was a fiction book. It's a very interesting slant, in my opinion. Anyway, I think that could be an audience for you.
Thank you
I'm not trying
very
to sell
much.
myself because you're published. You need somebody to actually help you, promote your books, perhaps.
Yeah, I've got to, as it's getting, bigger and bigger and hanging on and still selling. I've got to. I think you're right. I've got to make the most of those opportunities. Yeah.
Even without even without a publicist, just to go on social media and advertise your book abroad. But I think the German audience might be quite interested because they do learn about Holocaust studies now as part of the curriculum. So anyway, that was just my opinion. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. That's a really interesting point.
I look forward to buying your book and promoting it to my family and friends.
Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So, Stephen, how has writing this book and the research in it changed you? How does researching and articulating transform the person?
I suppose it's made me absolutely intolerant of any kind of prejudice, whether it's barroom talk or more serious political hatred. I just having seen where that talk leads to, I feel I've become more active in taking a stand and arguing and taking on the argument. I think it's brought me into contact with the Jewish faith in a way that could be quite transformative for me, and I've thought of how much further I want to go in that journey, possibly converting. I'm not sure at the moment, but it's something that keeps coming back to me, that idea.
Right. It was your mother's mother who was Jewish?
Father's mother, I believe.
Your father's mother who was Jewish. Right. So your father's mother who was Jewish married a pig farmer?
Yes.
Right. Leon the Pig Farmer was one of those films put on by the British Arts Council.
It was.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, I'd like to thank you so much for, number one, a really good book. And, hold it up again. That's the right way around. I Am Juden, available on Amazon. And even though it says it's 600 pages or something on the online, it's really about 500 pages. But it's a good read. And it's an even better read having met you. And it's helped me reflect a little bit on the storyline and how the characters have developed, and the humor and the research that has gone into it. And so I'd like to thank you for all of that work, for presenting the Holocaust to a wider audience than sometimes the Jewish community is able to reach, highlighting the fact that there were difficult positions aside from facing life and death that the Jews were put into, but also some of the truth about the righteous, about the non-Jewish world who were involved, and the good Germans and the partisans who put themselves out. So you've raised some great literary ideas and also some fabulous tensions. Thank you so much for doing that in I Am Juden, and thank you so much for sharing that with us this evening. Stephen, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That's extraordinarily kind. I'm very grateful to you for giving me this platform, for giving me this chance, and hello to everyone. I wish I could have talked to all of you. It thrills me, it really does, to see you, and it's people I know here from Twitter or elsewhere. It's just thank you to everyone who's interested and who's read my book. It means the world to me, it really does.